to Oh What a Lovely Podcast, where we explore the intersection of popular culture with the First World War. In this episode, Jessica, Chris and I take a look at the late 1970s British sci-fi fantasy series Sapphire and Steel, specifically Assignment 2. Running for 4 seasons from 1979 to 1982, Sapphire and Steel was ITV's answer to the BBC's Doctor Who. The show follows 2 enigmatic interdimensional operatives, Sapphire, played by Joanna Lumley, and Steel, portrayed by David McCallum. The origins and nature of Sapphire and Steel remain shrouded in mystery. Viewers are only given tantalising hints. They're ancient beings dispatched to Earth by commanding godlike voice from beyond time and space, and each assignment sees them unravelling strange and otherworldly cases that threaten the balance of reality. In Assignment 2, the railway station, also known as the girl who gave them flowers, Sapphire and Steel find themselves in an eerie, abandoned train station, and here ghost hunter George Tully attempts to contact the spirits of soldiers from wars past. But the station harbours something far more sinister than lingering echoes of history. A dark, malevolent force lies in wait, and everyone is in grave danger. Now, this was my suggestion as a topic. I'm not sure how familiar you both were with the show. Since I suggested it, it has oddly appeared on ITV's on-demand service, which made it easier for us all to watch, which is really odd because it's rarely been available to watch again. And I don't think it was even released on DVD until quite late. So I think if listeners are worried about spoilers, they probably should stop now, because I imagine it's riddled with spoilers, though there again, they've had plenty of time since 1979 to watch it.
It's been 50 years.
So I'm assuming you pair had never seen Sapphire and Steel before.
No.
Well, brought up in the wrong country, among other things.
Brought up in the wrong time period.
And were you blown away about how, in some respects, very different it is to Doctor Who, of which it's supposed to be its competitor?
It is noticeably different to Doctor Who in a way that I know I might kind of prefer, actually, for some of it. I mean, I used to watch the old old Doctor Who's. They used to be on Sunday morning on BBC Two, and when I was getting ready to go and work my supermarket job at Asda during secondary school and college and university and the like, I'd watch the old Doctor Who's on BBC before going off to work. So I can see how they would play against each other, but yeah, there was something quite appealing about Sapphire and Steel, despite the fact that it is also ridiculous nonsense.
I think you also described it when you were selling it to us, Angus, as not just but something like the Twilight Zone,
yeah,
which of course was my point of reference, because I didn't grow up with the old Doctor Who. I know the new Doctor Who, but I'm pretty sure they're fairly different. And this was very different from the new Doctor Who, certainly. Yeah, it did have a definite Twilight Zone feel. My understanding of Doctor Who is this more consistency and more consistent backstory. I can't see you getting the sort of Whovian obsession with backstory with Sapphire and Steel if it had gone on that you certainly do with Doctor Who. The assignments run over, 6 to 8 episodes, and their whole story, each season is a whole story in and of itself, which was very compelling, actually. They also had a habit of cutting it off very, very, you couldn't see the end of the episode coming. It would just stop.
Yeah, they like a good cliffhanger.
It was more than a cliffhanger. It was a shove you off the cliff and leave you dangling.
They're incredible compared to Doctor Who. They're really creepy. When people talk in the 70s about hiding behind the sofa, scared of Doctor Who has sort of wobbly sets and people in rubber suits. This doesn't have the rubber suits or any sort of special effects. It's very sort of theatrical in its performance, with a very limited, and certainly Assignment 1, I think, and 2 are kind of closed house sort of settings. It's them in an enclosed space, so there's not a lot of set variation, which obviously keeps the cost down, but it also makes it incredibly sort of pressurised that they're not going anywhere, and puts a lot of emphasis on the actors actually acting and not relying on special effects to do something whiz-bangy. And David McCallum will have been a fairly big hitter, I presume, in this sort of late 80s.
Well, because this is post The Man from U.N.C.L.E., isn't it?
And Called It.
It is, yeah. but Joanna Lumley was fairly well known at the time, and apparently I was looking on the Wikipedia page, and apparently the reason it didn't go beyond, what was it, 6 assignments or something, was because of the unavailability of the 2 stars. They were off doing other stuff. But it occurs to me that that sort of very limited set and the sort of claustrophobia that creates, certainly in this assignment, I haven't watched any of the other assignments, but that's actually something that was noticeable about and remarked on about Journey's End, the great First World War play, as a play, that it is this single set. Everything is set in the dugout, right? Now, the railway station's a little bit more expansive. You've got a buffet and a waiting room, and they move between different rooms in the platform itself and the bridge significantly. But you're right, it is this very enclosed space and a very limited number of actors within that enclosed space, creating all the dramatic tension, which Sheriff in some ways made his own with Journey's End.
One of the things that it reminded me of, and I imagine we'll come back to the sets later on because it was brilliant. I thought the actual physical location they were in was great. But weirdly, and it is weird because it predates it, it felt very much at times like watching a performance of The Woman in Black, which is odd because The Woman in Black comes after. I think it's like the 1980s at some point.
Yeah, I was going to say, what are the dates of The Woman in Black? Because I know it's been around forever, but I don't know when it started.
1983. But it felt very much like, some of the stuff that we've read recently, when we did, our little meandering horror bits and pieces. And one of the things that we often came away from it is like, it's a shame it wasn't creepier. It could have been more unsettling in its hollow. Now, this is 1970s creepy, so it's not, watching it in 2024, it's not that creepy. But it is creepier than a lot of the other creepy stuff that we've read and interacted with around the war.
I'm going to do the full-on spoiler here. I think it actually was creepier because it has a tragic ending. Because what they do is they sacrifice the human. And we're so used to non-tragic resolutions. And because it is such a limit, there are 4 main characters, I should say. I think the soldier, Pierce, does become a significant character by about halfway through. But from the beginning, you've got Sapphire Steel and Tully. And Tully it's a wonderfully complex character. There's real depth and you have real sympathy for him. And then in the end, he's simply sacrificed with sort of no emotion.
That's an interesting commentary on kind of war remembrance, in that the living get sacrificed to assuage the dead.
Is that also, could it be seen as a 60s sort of version of the general sacrificing the soldier, as it were, for the better good? 60s view of things.
I did have a question throughout about what Tully's Second World War experience had been.
Yeah, I was perpetually wondering whether or not there was a link between Tully and some of these soldiers, and actually it was all going to be about him.
Because the soldiers who appear, and not all of them are soldiers, the ghosts are not all soldiers, but there are...
Connected to war, aren't they, somehow?
Well, except right at the end, you get a whole lot of people on the platform, not all of whom necessarily...
Yeah, there's some factory workers or kind of shipwright workers.
You have an airman, but 2 of them are Second World War related. The submarine isn't that 1938? It's slightly pre-war.
Yeah, I think it might have been. Yeah,
it's related to war violence, but it's not actually.
Yeah, to people who weren't supposed to be there when they were.
I wonder if we should go back to that first few episodes and start to sort of unravel the plot before people. To help the listener who chances are have never heard of Sapphire and Steel or watch it. So
get really confused.
No. We should commit to this. If you're confused already, then come along.
So I guess it starts with George Tully, who is holding a séance, isn't he? Which is interesting with itself, to try and get in touch with the dead. And Sapphire and Steel arrive, and I think their first interaction is just that little sound of "Pack Up Your Troubles," isn't it? A whistling. Which becomes a recurring theme of pack up your troubles in your old kit bag.
Which meant I had it stuck in my head for days afterwards.
Oh, it's catchy.
It is catchy, annoyingly so.
But it's also, is that a connection to the ghosts having to pack up their troubles, and move on kind of thing?
Well, I was wondering, because it's a positive version. It's not keep the home fires burning, which is very nostalgic. But it's also one, and I know Angus, you've remarked on it previously. It's one of those that has an afterlife after the war, partly in variety, partly as Boy Scout campfire songs, in a way that some of the other popular songs from the time don't. So I think it might have been just that would have been what would have been the most familiar First World War associated song at the
Yeah,
time.
maybe so.
But in this instance, as the story unfolds, it's also so almost a metaphor for him packing up his troubles, emotional troubles that he has with his ex-girlfriend.
This is the soldier.
Yeah, the
Yes.
soldier, Sam Pierce,
Yeah.
who's whistling the tune. Actually, I'm not sure actually you ever see him whistling the tune, but it's meant to be him whistling the tune, which George Pierce on the station has somehow
George Tully on this.
it never really qualified. Has George Tully brought him back, or was he already there and George Tully was there? That connection between the two, I'm not completely sure.
I got quite a strong sense that it was the malevolent force that was calling these to the station, and then Tully had come along.
Then stumbled across them in some way.
But it wasn't clear what the point of the malevolent force was.
It fed on resentment and anger.
Yeah, but what did it want to do once it had fed on? Because then you get later on when Steele is trying to convince Pierce that it's not going to be the way he anticipates it, that it'll be a constant loop, that they'll be constantly brought back.
I assume the malevolent force was just wanted to eat, almost like a cow eating grass. It just wanted to eat anger and resentment to feed itself. It didn't necessarily need to grow bigger. It wasn't on world domination. It just wanted to feed and exist in its malevolence.
It's a shame it was in that time period, because nowadays it could just have a Twitter account and be absolutely happy as Larry for the rest of time.
Spouting stuff out.
But it also sort of highlights the we're back to that very enclosed space. It never seemed to want to get beyond the station. It brought people to the station. Pierce was the only one with an actual in-life association with the station. It's where he departed for war, and where his girlfriend had given him flowers, I presume. But the airman, was he Canadian, or was I getting the accent wrong?
Oh, I don't know, actually.
I don't know. I did make a note to myself of why is it that the non-officer common soldier has to speak with some sort of vernacular of Britain, which I always find slightly annoying. This weird, overdone.
It was when Lumley, Joanna Lumley as Sapphire, becomes the medium for the girlfriend and starts speaking with something that's not quite West Country.
Yeah, but there's a weird, a new accent has entered the room.
Exactly.
But it is funny how the common folk on sort of BBC, BBC or British television, that sort of, all have to have these sort of weird regional accents, unless they're officer class, and then they speak with regular.
Like Joanna Lumley does.
Yeah, or Dave McCallum doesn't really have much of an accent. I think he's Scottish, isn't he? So we have accents. So Tully brings it back. So, I mean, seances, which is interesting. Another reflection back to the popularity of seances and psychological research. And Tully is there with his cutting-edge reel-to-reel tape recorder, recording all the sound in the building
and his crucifix. I was fascinated by how prominent, because he starts by saying "in the name of God." The seance is deeply rooted in an understanding of its Christian associations, which I found fascinating, and you would not get that now. That was very much of the time, I think.
Yeah, I never picked up on that. And there's something important about the cross that I think I missed, because Steele's playing with the cross and sort of gives it back to him before he tells Tully to go onto the bridge, which I presume is his resentment and fear or something to do with the cross, which is why ultimately we skip to the end again.
I thought the resentment was that he was going to lose 5 years of life.
Yeah, and the universe's resentment at having its grand plan unpicked ever so slightly. Tully is supposed to live for 5 more years. This is how things are supposed to be, and removing him from that is, an aberration against time, space, and the universe. So the universe itself will resent the theft from it.
And in perpetuity, presumably.
And that then frees the men who have had their lives artificially shortened by war.
Well, it's more that they've died unjustly. So Pierce dies, but not within the scope of the war. He dies 11 minutes after the armistice. That's his...
Which pleasingly brings him into the awful typo in my First World War book, where I accidentally changed the time that the First World War ended. Because now actually I've been vindicated, because Sapphire and Steel, those noted scholars, have pointed out that some of it goes on for a little bit longer.
People were dying 11 minutes later.
So Sam Pierce, the ghost, he's resentful because he died, but he died 11 minutes after the end of the war, which slightly irked me that it never was really made clear how he sort of died. I think it's referred to as an accident, but is the accident...
Yeah, someone over there made a mistake.
Yeah, over where? Was that the German side? What was the accident? And it's just left. And that's the odd thing about Sapphire and Steel. They just don't worry about some of these questions and move on, There
are two other sort of ghost storylines that we get a bit of. The airman is on his last required mission and dies on that, even though he has to he sort of has to beg for it. So he's and that's his sort of resentment. Because
no one else will let him go up with them, so he ends up being stuck with some awful mission instead. It seems to be the implication.
He'd lost his previous crew, and so through superstition, this comes back to the sort of idea of superstition. No one else will take him on as a crew member.
And then they're three civilian workers who shouldn't have been working on a submarine that
was out for its sea trials.
Is experimental, and sinks, and they shouldn't have been working on that day anyway because they were civilians. So that's their source of resentment. It's not just shortening their lives; it's dying in unjust circumstances.
That submarine section where they just take the corridor and relight it is incredibly cheap way of doing it, of sort of doing a submarine scene, but it was incredibly effective. You really did think those men were in a submarine, and they did the cameras on a sort of a Dutch angle to give you the idea that the submarine was on its side. They just changed the lighting to be sort of blue and red,
and the sound effects, the banging and thumping. Yeah, no, it was really effective.
It was very well staged. It's not. This is slightly not necessarily First World War related, but I was going to say it's interesting that if you think about Doctor Who's companions are there are really for exposition, so Doctor Who could tell everybody what's happening. Invariably, Doctor Who's paired up, especially during this period, with women who don't do a lot but get into trouble, and he has to free them. What's interesting is Sapphire and Steel is Sapphire has a lot more agency, and she is key to the partnership. Of what is happening. It is not just David McCallum driving things.
He spends a lot of time basically telling Tully to shut up, and he's fantastically rude throughout the entire...
She tells him not to be rude. That's the thing. She doesn't just accept. She says, no, you've got to give him time. You've got to give him space. You've got to,
He also has a wonderful knack of, again, it's part of the staging, part of the plot, of looking in the wrong direction at exactly the right time. So that, a bunch of ghosts will pass by his other shoulder when he's looking in one direction, and he'll just completely miss them.
The gender politics is quite interesting because Tully, when they first meet, Tully's quite clearly trying to rationalize them for about half an episode. And then he stops and just sort of accepts, particularly Sapphire, as, having all these abilities and having a level of authority that he quite clearly wouldn't have expected of a human woman. There's no sort of explanation about why or at what point he just sort of accepts that these are otherworldly beings who can order him about.
He also starts off, and I was pleased again that this stopped, but for, a decent chunk of that first episode, when he meets Sapphire, he kind of moves into, "Ooh, hello, young lady. You're very beautiful. Maybe I can court you." Please, Tully, you're 80 years old, please.
Well, that's when it loops back later on where he's told to look after her, and one of the key plot points is that he has to look after her, and he fails to do it. He runs in fear of the unknown, and he leaves his post, which I guess then loops back to war and him leaving his duty and his responsibilities.
I really would have loved to know what his role was in the Second World War. And because he knows, there's that point where Steele says to him, "Do you know this song about pack up your troubles?" And he's the one who sings it, who teaches Steele the words. And says, yes, I know it. And there's an implication that he knows it.
And he's very reluctant to do it at first.
Yeah, I wanted to know why.
Tully also does a very fine line in nonsense terminology. So he talks about like psychicology experts in, and it's just like you've taken the word psychic and you've turned it into an ology made up word, and it just sounds great.
He's got a wonderful voice. Who's the I'm just trying to remember who the actor was.
Tully's a great actor, but he's not really was not someone I was familiar with when I IMDb'd him. He was not in a string of programs that I went, oh. He was kind of, oh.
I keep thinking his voice was so familiar. I have a feeling, and I cannot find it anywhere, that he read audiobooks for Chivers or something. And that's A, where I know the name, and B, why I know his voice, but I cannot find it anywhere.
So what do we think about the Sam Pace's girlfriend and that whole section where Sam Pace is sort of waved off from the railway station, is the implication, with his girlfriend giving him flowers. And there's almost a resentment to the cheery, good send-off, and he was almost thought he was going off to somewhere good fun. What I did find slightly odd was that Sam Pace's girlfriend is 12 years older than him and was his school teacher.
Yeah, they blow past that pretty quickly.
It was just a weird piece of plot that I wasn't quite sure why it had to be there. But anyway, so yes, does Joanna Lumley, does Sapphire become taken over by the girlfriend, or is it the other way around?
Yes. Yeah, she does.
She becomes the girlfriend.
And that resentment to that cheery goodbye and the women, it feels very Siegfried Sassoon. In regards to, it wasn't just his resentment at dying in a manner in which he shouldn't have died. It does kind of get extended over to the war and
it's a little bit about she forgot me. It seems to be the implication. We never sort of hear what happens to her after the war, but that she moves on after he dies. But then when she takes over, in the medium scene, the implication is that she didn't forget him.
No, as he did visit his grave. That gets shouted out at one point. Of course, I visited your grave.
Because there's that whole implication of he's leaving a green and pleasant land, how he remembers the flowers at Eastertide, and
there was definite references to Wilfred Owen's futility going on there.
And every time Pierce appeared, the platform, well, not every time, but seemingly randomly when he appeared, when it suited the plot, the platform would fill up with flowers and hanging baskets
and get warmer.
And we're back to that to religious references, because there's that the Pasch flower, which only appears at Easter, hence the name, and is incredibly rare, which is the Christian imagery of the sacrificed soldier as Christ.
We also have that scene slightly odd scene with Steele, who gets caught on the barbed wire, and he's not quite, is he going over the top? There's not really an implication of what he's doing, but he's sort of left, and when they change the set, so one of the doorways is almost like no man's land with barbed wire running across it, and he finds himself snagged on it, somehow transported into a First World War uniform.
So I think what happens to him, based off of what kind of some of the very, very early flashbacks, kind of sort of implied flashbacks, is that he ends up dying as Pierce died, getting caught up on barbed wire and with machine guns going off.
Because that's what had happened to him earlier when he'd become the airman crashing.
Oh yes, that's slightly odd actually, because the airman's somehow trapped in his plane cockpit and can't get out. Although the implication is he's part of a bomber crew later on, so that doesn't quite tie up. But because he volunteers to be rear gunner, doesn't he? Yeah, it doesn't quite tie up now. Now you've brought it to mind. But yes, I wonder if that's meant to be how Pace died. A slightly odd one. He would get caught up on barbed wire in no man's land, running 11 minutes after the armistice.
Yeah, well, it kind of depends, I think, on what the mistake that was made is, whether or not they were told to attack and go over the top, and for whatever reason the armistice news hadn't filtered down, and as a result the Germans were like, well, I guess we're going to have to kill these guys, otherwise they're going to bayonet us, which is partly how the last American soldier who dies in the war dies. Or if it's, something else has happened. But my feeling was that, because at first when Steele interacts with Pierce, or Sapphire does one of them, you kind of get like a flashback through eyes of like barbed wire and explosions and machine guns and lying in mud, and that's like the moment of his death. And I think that therefore Steele is kind of reliving a portion of that.
As usual, the First War experience is grounded in the Western Front.
And when the airman first appears, I thought it was a First World War airman, but it's not. It's very much a Second World War airman.
Well, a point occurred to me about that is the concept of the railway station seemed fitting for Pierce because he's waved off to war, but it's also the place he's returned to. So the train station becomes this sort of point of transition, but the concept didn't quite work as well for the airman because he wasn't coming and going. It worked really well for Pierce, that concept of the First World War.
But there's also an implication that Pierce is calling the others.
Yeah, he's the one that he's the focal point. He's drawing the others into a place of transit.
Which perhaps there's an idea there about the centrality of the First World War to a narrative of war is bad. That it all starts with this first war and its failure to end when it was supposed to end. That acts as a magnet for all the other resentments across the century.
It's sort of, lingering trauma is sort of centered on the First War, which everything else is drawn to.
I partly kind of wonder whether or not there's an interesting kind of beaching critique going on here, because firstly, it's a closed railway station to begin with. There'd be a lot more commuters if it wasn't. But also, it's a decayed closed railway station. It's a sign of things that have been lost and have been left to decay.
And the railway hotel that used to be attached.
Couldn't we ever work out this split off? So it's one of those weird things. Why do you have to keep leaving the room, going upstairs and sitting in a bedroom on his own to listen back to the tape recordings?
Well, it was the bridge became really important, right? That sort of place between, like no man's land in that sense. It's not the upline, it's not the downline, it's no man's land.
So I suspect the actual answer to your question, Angus, is so that Tully and Sapphire could have a conversation without Steele listening to things. And then he could come back and be Captain Exposition.
I just thought it could go. Well, that's the odd thing about this. So much of this there's not a lot of exposition because you kind of don't know what's going on, and they don't bother worrying about telling you what's going on.
But that works really well because Steele is tremendously arrogant in his way that he's navigating things. It fits perfectly for the character, and he just doesn't explain himself because he sees no reason to. And quite often he'll tell Tully, just sit down, shut up, tell me exactly what you know. You don't need to know this, stand over there. Because, he's an interdimensional being. He doesn't have time to give people the spark notes.
Which means that then Tully can go all innocence to his doom.
Yeah, with a blood-curdling scream like in one of the Alien films.
Yeah, and that's interesting because that's not really well explained either. At the end of his sort of sacrifice, you kind of, wow, what just happened there?
Because what happened? He sacrificed himself.
He doesn't sacrifice himself. Steele
he gets
sacrifices him.
Yeah.
It's very much not his will.
Yes, it's not his decision. Sapphire and Steel go outside. Sapphire picks a flower, goes, this is nice, and disappears. And Steel then dances down the platform to disappear.
Into the wall.
Into the wall. It's like, I've sacrificed a human to an eternity of unending torture.
The darkness.
Off we go.
Darkness is presumably still going to hang around this disused station.
Yeah.
Which may be a beaching metaphor there.
I do wonder. I'm not sure what happens if you think, if the 60s is central to the history of the First World War and a fixing of the First World War in memory. It's slightly odd that this is a very late 70s, early 80s sort of view of things. Has that moved on? It's odd that this is also talking about time and fixing things in time. Is the whole series. I'm not sure how much the 70s moved on how we thought about the First World War.
One of the interesting things in one of the commentaries I read when I went down my Wikipedia rabbit hole was that overall all the assignments put across the message that history's bad, progress is good. That what they're fighting is the past invading the present, and that they are about keeping the past where it belongs. So there's almost for the historian watching it, perhaps this is not the best series for the historian.
That sounds like a really thoughtful meaning that the writer, is it PJ Hammond, sort of put behind it, and that you went to, if you will go to exploring on IMDb, you will find a whole range of sort of heavy academic programs in this ilk. Whereas actually he did Z-Cars, The Bill, Midsummer Murders. And it's actually quite kind of lightweight Wycliffe, lightweight British crime dramas. And then there's this, it's kind of glaringly standing out as being something very, very different.
He then did Torchwood.
He did.
Interesting. Which is also the more creepy version of Doctor Who.
I was going to say, I can definitely see that connection.
He also did the Sweeney and Emmerdale, so some of that starts to fall down.
Also, with the holes in Torchwood, I can the plot holes in Torchwood are nearly as big as the ones in this.
I guess you could say this is a bit like Torchwood without the crash bang wallop. Yeah,
that's true. This is when we say go find ITVX, go and spend. It's about 4 hours of your time. It's very diverting. I was wildly ill while I watched this, and it took my mind off of how miserable I felt for a good 4 hours. So,
did you bulk watch them?
I did it in sort of
1 or 2 at a time.
2 hours. I did sort of hour-long sections of.
Because at 25 minutes, they're very easily digested.
And a decent chunk of those 25 minutes, the first 2 minutes or 3 minutes of the episode is a recap of the previous episode. Then you get the insane title sequence, and then you get the credit sequence at the end. So you're talking about like 19 minutes or so, maybe.
What's even worse is you skip intro, and all it still picks up of the last episode 2 minutes before the end of the last episode. So I thought I'd skip that bit.
And the very bizarre title sequence, which I don't think it makes sense for the scientists any more than it makes the rest of it makes sense to the historian.
Well, was watching this while slightly ill and feverish, did it help? Did it
Probably.
Did you end up with a very different interpretation of the episode than the rest of us got?
I'm not sure. It doesn't sound like it. Clearly, I had a religious fixation throughout. Not sure what was going on there.
I did wonder how a surviving veteran in 1979 watching it what on earth would they make of it? Could they reflect or see any of their wartime experience in it?
I'm not sure it was aimed at an audience of First World War veterans.
What is curious is I make it a half-assed attempt to find out what time it aired, because if this is ITV's answer to Doctor Who, it's very much more adult. So my assumption, as we only had 3 channels, you kind of watched what was on. So you sit it down to an ITV at whatever time. I'm guessing it's early evening-ish. It's not a 9 o'clock programme.
Yeah, it's kind of
it.
Yeah, 7,
you'd kind of just watch it and glaze through it. Because there'll be still plenty alive. They'll be getting to be extreme old age, but Harry Patch is extreme old age, isn't it? But
yeah, I like the idea of Alan Clark sitting there going, God, this is nonsense. And then, carrying on with it with his Alan Clarkiness.
Well, that's interesting, because is Sam Pearce a lion? Is he a lion? The whole lions donkeys theme does not necessarily come up in it,
except for the concept that mistakes could be made and that people paid with their lives for them, which is a slightly lions donkeys thing. But it doesn't go much further down that.
It's much more war poets. As I say, there was a section where I'm going, they've just read Futility.
Yeah.
And
they're quoting it at length.
Yeah, and they are now putting it into some weird sci-fi form.
Very good. Do we think we've mined Sapphire and Steel?
I think possibly we have.
I think we possibly have. I mean, it was great fun.
If you're going to go down the sci-fi First World War route, this definitely has it over the warm hand of Ghosts.
It is good fun, and it's creepier. Again, it doesn't have, creepiness exists on a scale. It doesn't have to be terrifying, but it is partly because there's a set and the environment for it. It does produce an environment and an atmosphere of creepiness really nicely.
It's incredibly cheaply made. I mean, it's shot on video at the time, but that doesn't mean it's wobbly sets, all a bit rubbish. It's really creepy. And it's really dark.
And it's beautifully acted. I mean, I've said it before. I will go back to what an amazing character I thought George Tully was. I was genuinely moved, and I thought Gerald James, who may not be well known, but he was superb.
So do we have any clue what we're looking at next time out?
Well, I'm going to suggest giving you guys some reading homework, which is to talk about Reginald Hill, the detective novelist, who has one great First World War novel masquerading as a detective novel, The Wood Beyond. But then the reason I'm suggesting it now is over Christmas, one of the Christmas books marketed was a collection of Hill's short stories from, newspapers and journals and stuff that had not been collected for publication before, one of which is A Christmas Truce Story. And at least two others have First World War references in them.
Christmas Truce Story, you say, let's start defrosting Mark Connolly.
Anyway, so having read that over Christmas, I thought we haven't talked about Hill. He's obsessed with the First World War. I've got a journal article, which you can also read, where I discuss his work from a while ago. But I thought, at the very least, I will quite happily send you my copy of this collection of stories for you guys to take a look at. But also, if you get a chance to read The Wood Beyond, it's a really interesting take. And I thought that could be quite an interesting. So if you don't mind, could we do that?
Yeah, very exciting.
Yeah, this sounds great.
Nothing like a plan, rather than our usually airy fairy wifty wafty. Well, we might do this, we might do that. We'll wait for someone to confirm.
Yeah, Snoopy is the Red Baron.
The only thing I should say is that, and I know we're still recording at the moment. We might want to think about we might have to take a break in terms of my coming month and recording time, but we'll talk about that when we start recording.
We'll figure that out. Very good. Well, Thank you very much. Hopefully everyone will enjoy Sapphire and Steel and it'll have a resurgence.
Yeah, and then they'll hire us to write more First World War things, because episodes as they return to the train station in 2024.
And our listeners can help me identify why I know Gerald James's voice so well.
Right, great stuff. Right, we'll see you all next month. Bye.
See you then. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. Oh, we want with eggs and ham, when we got plum and apple jam. Come fast, Richard, how can we spend the Bolivian? Oh, 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 it's a lovely war.